Hello, welcome to our first evolution lecture. Today we'll start talking about evolution. So, what is evolution? Evolution is genetic change within a population over time. So, in order to understand that definition, we need to, of course, first be able to understand what a population is. Okay. Oh, right. I wanted to remind you of this. That's why I put that in here. If you go to our useful stuff module on Canvas and go to evolution, there's a whole bunch of stuff, even longer than is shown here. These first ones here, up here, especially are helpful for just understanding the basics of evolution. So my lectures aren't doing it for you. The book's not doing it for you. I suggest that you go here. I particularly like this one. And this one, these people at this thing called Stated Clearly do a great job. All right, so what is a population? So evolution is genetic change within a population over time. So a population is simply all the members of a particular species in a given area that are capable of interbreeding, meaning that they exchange genetic information. Right? They reproduce sexually, they recombine their genetic information and pass their genes on. That is essential, as we'll come to see. All right, and to understand that, you need to be able to understand what a species is. And a species is simply a group of living organisms. Actually, not necessarily living, because we have fossil species as well. So, nix that. A group of organisms consisting of similar individuals capable of exchanging genes / interbreeding. Okay, so they're similar enough that they that we would look at them and say, oh yeah, those are the same. And they can breed with each other. Each species is recognized and has a two-part scientific name that consists of a genus and species name. All right, so let's look at an example of this. So there's a species of gray wolf. That's the common name, gray wolf. Its scientific name is Canis lupus. Okay, so there's population of Canis lupus that live in North America, and that's outlined here in the green. Every place you see is where these wolves occur, and wolves are actually really wide-ranging, and so they can go long distances and interbreed with each other. Okay, so when we are talking about evolution and we're talking about genetic change, we're talking about genetically determined characteristics change within a population changing over time. Okay? So sometimes people will get confused and think that an individual can change their genetic characteristics over time, but they can't, right? So you can't change, say, how tall you are, because that's genetically determined, right? How tall you are is how tall you are. That's not going to change over your lifetime. Okay, so genetically determined characteristics of an individual do not change over time. So we're talking about within a population over time. So I put this in here to just use this as an example. So Pokemon has it wrong. They show individual organisms evolving over time, right? Getting more complex. And that's not how it happens. It's a whole population of individuals changing over time. And individuals change over time, populations change over time and they adapt to their environment. Small changes accrue over time that mean that they become better adapted to their environment. Okay, so still on this topic of what does genetic change mean. So a very modern definition of genetic change is that it's a change in allele frequencies over time. Right? So let's look at an example in order to understand this. Okay, so say there's a population of tigers, and in that population of tigers, there are orange tigers and there are white tigers, and the fur color is a single gene that has two alleles. Right? There's the orange fur allele, which I put as a big F, and the white fur allele as a little f. Okay, so say you go out and you start studying this population of tigers, and you go out and you count the number of orange tigers and the number of white tigers. Okay? That will then give you an idea of the frequency of these alleles, right? Because the orange tigers are going to have that allele, and the white tigers will have the little, the orange tigers will have the big F allele, and the white tigers will have the little f allele. Okay, so you could say in the starting population, there's mostly orange tigers, so there's most, the big F allele is most frequent, and there's a few white tigers, and the little F allele is not very frequent. Okay, so if you're studying evolution, then you would want to go out, if you could, and sample this population over time, over long periods of time, and see, did the proportion of orange-furred tigers to white-furred tigers change? Okay? And if it did, which is what's shown with these pie graphs here, if it did, that means evolution has occurred, right? Because genetic change has occurred. The allele frequencies have changed, right? So over time, the orange allele, the big F, becomes less common, and the little f becomes more common. Okay? And what that would mean for the population is that there are more white tigers than there used to be, right? And so the population of tigers is evolving to be more white. Okay? Why this would occur could have various causes, and all goes back mostly to natural selection that we'll be talking about in a coming up lecture. Okay? But this is essentially what evolution is. It's a very simple idea. Populations change over time, their allele frequencies change over time, and that leads them to have different characteristics that frequently make them more well adapted to their environments. Okay, so remember a couple things. One, many genes have multiple alleles, and this means that there is genetic diversity within a population. Okay, this is actually really good for populations when it comes to evolution by natural selection, because it gives more possibilities for survival. That concept might make more sense to you after we do talk about natural selection. Okay, and remember, where do new alleles come from? They come from mutations, right? So reaching back to our mutation lecture, remember that when humans first evolved in Africa, all humans had actually two copies. They were homozygous for the dark skin allele of the MC1R gene. Okay? It says it was fixed. That means there was no variation within the population. Okay? As humans migrated north out of Africa, there was a mutation in that gene that gave rise to the V6OL allele, which leads to red hair and fair skin, right? That was an advantageous characteristic to the north, and so it was kept in the population, and now we have a more diverse population of humans, right? Because that allele came about. All right, so most of this lecture, or the rest of this lecture, we're going to talk about how do we know evolution happens. Okay, so we are going to think about and evaluate the evidence. There is a ton of scientific evidence in support of evolution, so much so that evolution is considered to be a scientific theory. Okay? So in science, a theory is an idea that has a ton of scientific evidence to back it up and no evidence against it. So it means that a lot of studies have been done that support the hypothesis that evolution occurs, and none of those studies indicated that hypothesis needed to be rejected. Okay? And so this makes it a scientific theory. In normal day-to-day speech, we use theory. Actually, how we should be using hypothesis. So if your car doesn't start or something, you might say, yeah, my theory is that my battery is dead. What you really mean is that your hypothesis is that your battery is dead. But, that's how we use it in day-to-day speech. When we're talking about science, a scientific theory is a well-accepted idea. Okay, so evolution is a well-accepted idea. Most scientists, mainstream scientists, the majority of scientists don't question whether or not evolution has occurred or is occurring. We just know that it does. And evolution is a really important area of study. It really forms the foundation of the rest of our understanding of biology. So why populations exist as they do, why they behave as they do, how they interact with their environment, how cellular stuff works, all of that has its basis in evolution and can help us understand it. Okay, So what we're going to do is talk about these 4 major lines of evidence for evolution. Today, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the fossil record and comparative anatomy. And then in the next lecture, part 2, we'll address molecular biology and experimental and observational studies. So it's just got to be too long of a lecture to talk about all of them, so I thought I would break them up. Okay, so first we'll talk about fossil record, what it is, why it is evidence for evolution, and then we'll talk about comparative anatomy, what it is, and why it is evidence for evolution. Before we do that, though, we need to get some facts straight about the Earth and life. Okay, so the first is that Earth is old, really old. It's about 4.6 billion years old, okay, which is a little bit hard for humans to fathom because it's so long ago that it was created. And life also evolved a long time ago, about 3.85, some sources say 3.8 billion years ago. Either way, really long time ago. Okay, and so this is a little timeline of billions of years ago, when things happened. Okay. So one thing to notice is that humans evolved way down here, almost at the 0. Okay. And that's because humans evolved very recently, only about 200,000 years ago. This doesn't actually work. This is just a picture that I picked up. There's no movie. Don't click that. But this helps you understand, hopefully, the scale at which evolution has occurred, and understand what a short time humans have really been on this earth. Okay, so the analogy is with a clock. The hour hand goes around once, and that's 12 hours. Okay, so thinking about all of geological history, since the Earth was created, and putting it on the scale of 12 hours. Okay, so here at we'll say midnight, okay, is when the Earth was created. Okay, it wasn't until about 2 o'clock in the morning that you had the first prokaryotes evolve. So that was the first life. And then for a very, very, very long time on Earth, it was just prokaryotes. Okay, all the way up until about 7 o'clock in the morning. Not too long before the first eukaryotes evolved, some prokaryotes evolved the ability to do photosynthesis, which I know we haven't learned about yet, but photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide from the air and creates oxygen, and that led to oxygen inundating the atmosphere, and that allowed for the evolution of complex eukaryotes that did cellular respiration with oxygen. And then we had eukaryotes that were single-celled all the way up until a little bit after 9 a.m., maybe 9:15 or so. And then we had multicellular organisms evolve. Everything was in the water, though, until here they started coming out of the water and onto land, both plants and animals. Okay. Here at, very close to midnight is when we had the radiation of mammals. So that's when the dinosaurs went extinct and mammals took over as the dominant form of life on Earth. And then right here, just really right before what would be noon on our 12-hour clock is when humans evolved. Okay, so we're a really new species. Other species you talk about being around for 50 billion years, or a younger species might be around for 1 billion years, or a million years, not 50 billion, 50 million. But humans, it's only 200,000 years. So we shouldn't feel so high and mighty. I guess that's the point. We haven't been around that long. Other life has been around much longer. All right, then the other thing about the Earth is that the present landscape that we see when you go out and look at the landforms around you, was produced by geological processes that are the same now as they were in the past. So in the past we had volcanoes. They acted exactly the same and did the same kind of thing. Same with weathering of rocks and erosion and sedimentation. So we can assume that the forces that create the geological landforms we see today are the same as in the past, and that helps us understand our first line of evidence, which is the fossil record. Okay, So the fossil record shows evidence of past life. And there's basically 6 types of fossils. Likely you're most familiar with these petrified fossils, which would be mainly bones that have been, that the bone material has been replaced with mineral material, making them like rocks, right? But they're in the shape of the bone. Dinosaur bones, are probably the most famous example for this, but there are many other types of fossilized bones as well. There's also molds, kind of like an impression. A cast would be, kind of like if you're playing with Play-Doh and you fit it into a shape and then get that shape out, that's a cast. Carbon films, that's, it's kind of like the remnants of a plant often, or a very soft organism. Trace fossils include things like footprints, nests, poop, that kind of stuff. And then there's also preserved remains. So this is an insect preserved in amber. Amber is tree sap that's really old, and that just preserves the whole organism. So lots of different types of fossils, but they all do the same thing. They let us understand past life. Okay, and this really does relate to geology because the fossils are found in the rocks. Okay, so different fossils are found in different rock formations or layers. Okay, a rock formation are rocks that were formed at the same point in geological history. Okay, so if the fossils are found in different rock layers and the rock layers were laid down at different times, then this indicates that all of the fossils in any given layer were left by organisms that lived at the same time, right? So these organisms here all lived at the same time, and we could figure out how long ago that was by doing some carbon dating, okay, which you can read about in your book if you want to. In general, the oldest fossils are in the oldest rocks. So down here are the oldest rocks. This is increasing time, and the youngest fossils are in the newest rocks. Okay, so you can dig down into the earth and go on a journey through the geological history of the earth and also the evolutionary history of the earth. So fossils give us a peek at what ancient life looked like. Okay, many fossils are remains of extinct species that are ancestral to modern extant species. So what does extinct mean? Extinct means dead, basically, no longer living, right? So if a species is extinct, there's none of that species left on Earth. Okay, extant is the opposite. Extant is living. And so all of the species, all of the organisms that you see when you're walking around are extant species. We are also extant species. So if I can do this without accidentally going backwards. There we go. Okay, so fossils show evidence of evolutionary change over long periods of time. Things that we couldn't possibly hope to observe in our own lifetime, right? Because it's happening on the time scale of hundreds of thousands to millions of years. Okay, and this is called macroevolution. This is how we have got from being a single-celled organism to the humongous diversity of multicellular life that we see on Earth today. That's the study of macroevolution. Microevolution is evolution that we can observe, and we'll talk about a couple examples of that as well. Okay, when you're studying fossils, say you're a paleontologist, you are often looking for things called transitional species. You might have heard of these called missing links. Okay? They're important because they're intermediate forms that show the characteristic of multiple species or groups, and finding them and figuring them out allows us to make connections between different groups of organisms to understand the evolutionary history. So let's look at one example here. So here's one example of a transitional species, and this is called Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is only known from the fossil record, so it's completely extinct. It lived millions of years ago. And the really cool thing about it is that it has shows that it shows the connection between dinosaurs, which are reptiles, and birds. So if you look at the fossil, you can see that it has reptilian characteristics, and you probably can't see it from here. But in its mouth, it has teeth. Birds don't have teeth. Many lizards have teeth, but birds never have teeth, right? And they have beaks. This thing has a beak, but it has it with teeth in it, okay? And then it has backbone tails with a backbone, so they had tails. Those are both reptilian characteristics common to things, like the dinosaurs, which are reptiles, or lizards that we see on Earth today. But it also had avian, which are bird characteristics as well. It had feathers, and it had a beak. Okay? So it's like this mashup of both the reptile characteristics and the bird characteristics, and it indicates that indeed birds did evolve from the dinosaur lineage. Okay, so this shows a bunch of technical information. This is showing the evolutionary tree for a lot of dinosaurs. If we just go back to here, these are, this is like Tyrannosaurus rex, that theropods, that group of dinosaurs, which is extinct now, but gave rise to Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx is an ancestor of living birds. Okay? Archaeopteryx didn't directly evolve into birds. Instead, an ancestor to both Archaeopteryx and living birds had characteristics that they both shared. Okay? And I don't know about you guys, but knowing that and looking at some birds, they kind of look like dinosaurs. I always think that. All right, let's look at another example. This is a really cool example of using the fossil record to reconstruct the evolutionary history of whales over 50 million years. Okay, so what are whales? Whales are the only fully aquatic mammals. Whales include things, also like dolphins, orcas, porpoises, as well as whales like the humpback whale, the blue whale, etc. Okay. Mammals all have hair, feed, milk to their young, and most, except for few exceptions, give live birth. Okay. And here's an example of a blue whale, right? So a blue whale is the largest living organism. They are, completely in the water, and they're so highly adapted to their water environment that people first thought that they're more closely related to fish. But then they realized that that they actually have some mammalian characteristics. Although they have these characteristics that make them very well adapted to the water, they do actually have sparse hair. They feed milk to their young, and they give live birth, and they are mammals, right? And they breathe oxygen. Okay, so here are some characteristics of whales. They have their nose at the top of their head, and they breathe through a blowhole. Instead of arms, they have flippers. Most of their skin is very smooth and hairless. If they have any hair, it's usually only up here, and often mostly when they're young, not as they get older. So the smooth, hairless skin makes them slip through the water very nicely. Right? The forelimbs allow them to paddle. Breathing through the top of your head when you live in the water is very important. Right? You could just stick the top of your head out to breathe rather than having to put your whole snout up. There are no hind limbs and to get in the way of swimming, and the tail is very paddle-like. Okay? So all of these characteristics makes whales highly adapted to their aquatic environment. Okay? And yet whales actually evolved from land mammals about 50 million years ago. Okay? And we know this because of evidence from the fossil record. That evidence indicates that a land mammal called Indohysis was the first quote-unquote whale. Right? It didn't look anything like a whale that we see today. It was a completely terrestrial or land animal. It liked to hang out near the water, probably hunted in the water, but had characteristics that you would associate maybe more with a deer or a wolf. They're kind of the size of a wolf. They had hoofs, though, so actually whales are related to deer, interestingly. They have fur on their body. They had long, thin tails that helps with balance. They had 4 limbs. They have the nose at the front of the face. All those characteristics that you would think of, for an animal that lives on land. And yet, this is the ancestor of all living whales. So you could think of it as belongs to the lineage that gave rise to the whales that we see today. So the question, of course, is how did we get from Indohysis to a whale? Right? So how does this happen? And how the heck do we know that it happened? Well, the answer is all from the fossil record. And I'm going to instead of me trying to explain it, I'm going to let the scientist who figured it all out tell you in the form of a video. So here we go. Hopefully, here we go.
It was there that he made the kind of find most paleontologists only dream about. A fossil that would rewrite one of evolution's greatest stories.
I found the back of a skull that I couldn't identify. It had a very good, well-preserved ear region, and that offered the clue to what it was.
The shape was familiar, but in other ways it was like nothing Gingrich had ever seen.
This is the original specimen. It's the one we found in about 1978. There are several things that strike you. One is it's very similar in size and shape to the back of a skull of a wolf.
But there was something odd about this skull. On its underside was a walnut-sized bump.
If this wasn't here, I would think that this was an archaic carnivorous mammal, what we call a creodont. But it is here.
It was part of the animal's inner ear, and it had a distinctive shape. A shape found today in only one kind of animal: whales. What was the ear of a whale doing on the skull of an animal that resembled a wolf? Gingrich was intrigued, so he constructed a model of what the creature's full skull might have looked like. He wondered, was his find a crucial missing link? The first fossil evidence ever found for one of Darwin's most daring claims, that whales had evolved from land mammals. To know for sure, Gingrich would need to find more fossils. Ones that would show each stage of the whale transformation, what scientists call transitional forms.
I want to line them all up. I want anyone to be able to see it and believe it because they've seen it.
Basilosaurus, a 40-million-year-old creature already known to science. Basilosaurus lived full-time in the water. If whales had evolved from land mammals, they had done so long before Basilosaurus. So Gingrich didn't think the bones would be of much interest. But he couldn't have been more wrong. After only a few days of digging, he made his second amazing find. It turned out that Basilosaurus had something modern whales have long since lost.
For the first time, we've got whales that have legs.
The bones were small but unmistakable. A pelvis, a kneecap, even toes. This whale had a complete set of leg bones. Gingrich brought back as much of the skeleton as he could carry. It was dramatic evidence that whales had once been four-legged animals. Since Gingrich's finds, he and others have filled in more of this fantastic story. Scientists now think that the earliest ancestor of whales was similar to this 50-million-year-old wolf-like mammal called Synonyx. Synonyx was a predatory scavenger that lived and hunted along the shores of an ancient sea. Perhaps its descendants found the water a source of abundant food and a haven from competition. Over millions of years, front legs became fins, rear legs disappeared, bodies lost fur, and took on their familiar streamlined shape. Since Gingrich's first find, named Pakicetus, the list of known transitional whales has grown. It now includes Ambulocetus, Rhodocetus, Durodon, as well as Basilosaurus. They reveal another element of whale evolution, the gradual migration of nostrils to the top of the head, as whales adapted to breathing in the water.
How did whales lose their legs?
As the years went by, they evolved into newer types of...
Gingrich's work demonstrates what Darwin himself insisted, that the evidence for evolution is all around us, if we choose to look for it. And bones aren't the only evidence of whale evolution. Their ancestry is also visible in the way they move. Frank Fish studies how today's marine mammals swim. He looks for their evolutionary heritage in the way they move through the water.
The big question is, how do you go from a terrestrial mammal that ran around on all four legs to something such as a dolphin, which now doesn't have any legs at all and is well adapted to swimming in the oceans?
Even though whales look like fish, they don't swim like them. Fish swim by flexing their spines from side to side, like the shark. But mammals swim differently. This otter swims by undulating its spine up and down, in exactly the same way that whales do. And, as it turns out, in the same way that land mammals use their spines when running. Whales took with them into the water their ancestral way of moving, and we can still see it 50 million years later.
Hold on. I don't know why it won't just let me every single time. Dang. Alright. So there was a little bit of discrepancy in that talked about Pakicetus, that did not talk about Endohysis. So Endohysis is one step backwards from Pakicetus. So it's still the same thing. So here shows an evolutionary tree of some of the whale evolution, going from a land mammal to a fully aquatic mammal. And so here are the general ideas. So over the 50 million years, the hind limbs got smaller. Why? Because they got in the way of swimming. The nostrils moved to the top of the head to make it easier and faster to breathe. The tail became paddle-like. That helped them swim. Their body hair was lost because it made them more streamlined. Their front limbs became flippers in order to swim better, and they lost their back limbs entirely. All right, so that's it for the fossil record. We could go and do a lot more information about the fossil record, as we could with any of these. Evolution is a huge and fascinating topic. So if you ever get a chance to take an evolutionary biology class that's just on that, if you're at all interested, I highly recommend it. All right, our second line of evidence is comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy is the study of structures of organisms and studying them in order to understand how they are related to each other and to other ones, and to reconstruct evolutionary history. So we just saw in that video that Dr. Gingrich was doing what's called comparative anatomy. He was looking at bones, comparing the fossil bones to bones of a living whale, right, to understand how to reconstruct evolutionary history. So comparative anatomy is a very important tool in understanding evolutionary history. It can do numerous things. So first of all, it can reveal similarities in structures that can be explained by shared ancestry. That would be evolution from a common ancestor. Okay, and that's what we just saw with the whale when he said that the fossil whale had a distinct ear bone that was only found in living whales. That means that that's something called a homologous structure. Homologous structures are structures that have the same evolutionary origin. Okay, so for the whales, the living whales have that ear bone because their ancestors had it, and they're direct descendants. Here's another example using extant organisms. Okay, So organisms that have 4 limbs and a backbone are called tetrapods. Okay, humans are tetrapods. All mammals are tetrapods. And this is showing only mammals. But in addition, lizards are tetrapods, so those are reptiles. Amphibians are tetrapods. And actually, birds are also tetrapods. But so homologous structures are ones that have a similarity because they have a common ancestor. Okay, if you look at the forelimb, and that's what these are looking at, the 4 limbs of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat, you see that they have the same bone structure. Okay, you might characterize this as 1 large bone, 2 smaller bones, and lots of little bones. Okay, so we see the same pattern repeated in all tetrapods. They have 1 large bone, 2 smaller bones, and lots of little bones. Okay, we all have this because we have a common ancestor that had this. Okay, so the idea is this. So in our evolutionary tree, all tetrapods evolved from a common ancestor that had 4 limbs with the 1 bone, 2 bones, lots of little bones pattern. Okay, and so we have kept it over evolutionary time. Okay. Another example of homologous structures we find in the embryo also of tetrapods, or not only of tetrapods, sorry, of vertebrates. So these are vertebrates. Vertebrates include all animals with backbones, so like fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds are all vertebrates. And if you look at the very early embryonic stage of these organisms, they look strikingly similar. Okay, so here's a human, chicken, turtle, and shark. Early embryonic stage, we're talking, I think 2 to 4 weeks old, something like that. You see that they all have similar structures. They all have a bony tail, okay, including humans, and these gill pouches. Okay. Why do we have them? Well, because the ancestor of all these organisms had them. Okay. In humans, of course, we outgrow our tail. What happens is you have a tailbone, and that's here, but your limbs get longer, so you no longer have a tail. And actually, our gill pouches grow to be part of our ears. Okay, so they don't have any function as being gills. So depending on the type of organism, sometimes they keep these embryonic structures. Like in the case of a shark, it has a tail and they live in water, so they have gills. Or they don't, right? So all turtles do not have gills. Most live on the land, and even those that live in the ocean have to breathe air, and same with chickens. Okay, but those are homologous structures because we all have them because an ancestor had them. Okay. Comparative anatomy can also reveal what are called vestigial structures, and these are structures that are present but have no current function, and they're only present because the ancestors had it. Oops. Oh. Oops. I don't know why all that's in there. Sorry about that. Okay, so here are some examples of vestigial structures. So the hind limb bones of living whales are vestigial structures. You might also call these, evolutionary holdovers. They're present in the living whales because the ancestors had legs. These are completely, vestigial structures don't serve any function anymore. And if you notice, these leg bones are not even attached to the backbone anymore. They're just there hanging out. Okay. They'll probably always be there because they're not causing any problems, so they're not making it so the whale can't survive and reproduce. So they'll probably just always hang out there. Okay. We also have some examples of vestigial structures in humans. Humans evolved from the same lineage that gave us chimpanzees and also gorillas. Okay, and those organisms and our ancestors ate a lot more plant material and needed bigger jaws to chew it up and digest it. And our wisdom teeth are this last set of molars that we get that we don't really have room for in our jaws. Okay, so they're still there. They're there because our ancestors had them, because our ancestors had bigger mouths and more teeth. We have them as an evolutionary holdover. They usually cause us problems, however, and we have to get them taken out. All right, so comparative anatomy, let's see, where is I going with this? Can also reveal similarities in structures that are explained by something called convergent evolution. Okay? This is when unrelated organisms have structures that serve the same purpose. They are unrelated, so they don't have a common ancestor that has it. Okay, and this results in something called analogous structures. Okay, so this is different from homologous structures have an ancestor that had them. Analogous structures don't. So these are non-homologous structures that don't have the same evolutionary origin but have the same purpose. So here's an example. Insects have wings like this damselfly, and birds have wings like this swallow. Right? They both serve the same function to let the animal fly around, but they don't have any homology about them. They don't have any of the same structures. They didn't evolve from a common ancestor that had wings, right? We're widely divergent from, the birds are widely divergent from insects. Okay? So same purpose, totally different. And why they evolved, why do you have convergent evolution? Well, the organisms have experienced similar pressures, similar what are called selective pressures, to get up in the air and fly around, to escape predators, to find prey, etc. Okay, and then also comparative anatomy can highlight differences in structures. Okay? A lot of times these differences in structures are the result of evolutionary change during descent from a common ancestor, right? So we have just talked about the fact that 4 limbs of these tetrapods all have a similarity, right? But they also are very different, right? Although we have that same similar one to many bone structure, the bones have been modified for their purpose, right? And that is due to evolutionary change from descent from a common ancestor, right? As those organisms experienced different environments, different traits were selected for that caused them to be modified to become adapted to their environment. Okay, of course, also you might be studying 2 things that you think are similar enough to be related, and then you find out that the differences might indicate that the organisms are not related at all, right? And that's happened. People who have been studying, different organisms have, lumped them in the same group because they have shared structures, and then, figure out later that it's not because they're homologous, it's actually because they're analogous. So always have that as well. Alrighty, so just to recap, we just went through the evidence from the fossil record and comparative anatomy in support of evolution. Our next lecture will cover evidence of molecular biology and experimental and observational studies.